Uh, wow. Listening to all of you, excuse me, there's such a range of interests and such a range of possibilities in terms of inquiry. Um, I thought what I would do is just kind of do a brief overview of inquiry in general. And at any point in time, if you have a question about anything that I'm saying, please go ahead and just raise your hand, and Dr. Love will let me know that that's happening, because I don't always pay attention to the screen like I should. Uh, so I guess I want to start off with philosophy. Philosophy is important because that's your starting point. We can know a lot of things. We can know a lot of things about a lot of things, or a lot of things about just something in particular. But all of that knowing starts from a place of assumption. It's a place of belief. It's the it's how you understand and organize and view the world. Um, we talk about that in terms of philosophy. We make philosophical assumptions. So when we talk about epistemology, for example, we're talking about the philosophy and the assumptions we make about knowing and coming to know about knowledge, about acquiring knowledge and transferring or transmitting or sharing knowledge, and where it comes from and what it is. Obviously, being reflectful and understanding your own assumptions with regard to knowledge and knowing is really important, because that has implications for everything that you do in terms of inquiry, for how you recognize problems, how you determine relevant theory, how you decide on appropriate questions and methodology, how you analyze the information that you collect, and the conclusions that you ultimately draw. Oftentimes what happens is that research proceeds without first the consideration of theory. And that's problematic, because essentially it fails to recognize the important starting points, and it fails to give due credit to those starting points in terms of the decisions that we make with regard to inquiry. So you have to stop and step back and think about, okay, what do I believe? What are the assumptions that I make about the world, how the world works, about what is valuable, what is value, right? That's axiology, about the nature of reality. So stop and think about it, right? If you think that a reality is something that is absolute, that it exists and that operates in the way that it in a lawful way everywhere, regardless of whether or not anyone is there to see it, then your approach to inquiry is going to be very different than if you believe that reality is a construction, and that reality exists as we construct it or is influenced by our perceptions of it. It's going to have implications for the kind of research designs that you ultimately choose for your theories, for your questions, right? So thinking about ontology, epistemology, axiology, thinking about your fundamental beliefs, is really an important first start. The second thing is to understand that all research, all inquiry starts with a problem. So it can be like Daniela's problem about feeding the cats, right? It might sound like it's not important or that it's trivial, but look at everything that's embedded in that, right? So there's the values that she has with regard to taking care of the cats, the values that she has related to her sense of responsibility for taking care of the cats. So she's starting off with these values, with these presumptions about responsibility that basically set a framework, set parameters for, and that set indicators for how that problem should be addressed. She recognizes that part of the challenge with dealing with that problem is a lack of knowledge or lack of information. So she tried to get information about what was appropriate, what was not just appropriate in terms of what to feed them, but how often to feed them, and so forth. She recognized that getting knowledge was an essential part of refining the problem and determining whether or not there were any existing questions that needed to be addressed in order to solve her problem. She understands that all of the other things notwithstanding, there are feasibility or practical considerations that need to be put into the equation, right? So feeding, excuse me, ideally feeding can be one thing, but also recognizing that, whatever she chooses, she's going to have to be paying for it, right? And now it's a matter of, thinking about, how much and how she can exercise that responsibility faithfully, and at the same time, not do harm to herself or to others, because she's taking and applying maybe more resources than are available to address that particular issue. In other words, she's trying to be sure that she's not solving one problem and ending up causing additional problems. As she starts thinking about all of that, she's thinking about, okay, what are the things that I believe? What are the regular mechanisms? What do I think is already connected to each other, right? What are the cause and effect relationships that I believe that I believe exist, either because I believe them as a matter of philosophy or assumption, or I understand and I believe them as a matter of experience and observation, right? What are those things, those connections? And what of everything related to cat feeding is important to consider in the first place? Essentially, what she's doing is she's casting around for a theory. Theories are these things that help us in at least one, and the best theories, all three of these ways, right? Theories are explanations for phenomena, right? First, theories are descriptions of phenomena. They describe what we're seeing in terms of the elements and the relationships between those elements and the rules that govern those relationships. Good theories describe specific phenomena. So it could be leadership, it could be student retention in school, it could be entrepreneurship or the factors that contribute to successful entrepreneurship and so on. What essentially she's looking for a theory, and there doesn't seem to be one. So she's having to go ahead and engage in theory building. Now, for some of us, when we're addressing our own problems, we look around and we find existing theories that seem to provide a good framework for what it is that we're looking at. And that framework can be really useful for deciding what specific elements or variables are important to consider. And that theory is important as a result of the third thing that good theories do. And that is, good theories enable us to make predictions. A good theory helps you to anticipate if you have characteristics or values, or you have conditions of one kind, and there's some intervention or something happens, then there's going to be a consequence, and that consequence, according to the theory, should always occur. Should always occur, right? So if you have an uninjured, fairly normal finger, and you're driving a nail into a piece of wood and you miss the nail and hit your finger, it's going to hurt, right? Whether you're looking at it physiologically, right, you're looking at it from the kinesiologist's perspective and saying, yeah, that is going to cause a stimulation of the pain nerves, those pain nerves are going to send a signal to the brain's going to interpret it as pain. That reason that happens is because it's a safety mechanism for ourselves physically. If we didn't recognize and we didn't stay away from things that were painful, we'd be more likely to injure ourselves or kill ourselves in life. So pain, even if it's uncomfortable or not very, not something that anybody wants to approach, it's got a survival value, and that's why it's there. That's why we feel it. And if you're a physiologist or exercise physiologist or whatever, you can probably provide a more detailed, more sophisticated explanation for the mechanism of pain. All of that to say is that when you're exploring the literature, when you have an idea about a problem and you're looking around for a theory, there are three things in particular that you really want to look for in the theory. One is you want to see whether or not the theory is applicable to your question or problem, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're doing research, and I'm just going to say leadership just because I have a couple of students working on dissertation and they're both working on leadership. Let's say you're interested in leadership related to something or other, and you cast around for a theory, right? You're looking for the theories. The theory needs to be something that provides you with an explanation, not of leadership in general, but the leadership questions that you want to ask in particular. There could be a theory of leadership that makes a lot of sense and that you like a whole lot, but doesn't connect to the research problem or research questions that you're asking. That theory then doesn't work for you. You need to find another one. Theory is not just a theory that describes a general phenomenon of interest. A good theory for research needs to be able to give us some information about what's important to pay attention to. What are the elements that are connected to the questions or the problems that we're asking? And how do those elements work with each other? And what kinds of predictions can we make based on that theory? And then we can test to see whether or not those predictions come true. Right? We can determine whether or not in our case and with our question, that theory provides us with information or not, and also whether or not that theory seems to hold true in the situation that we're exploring. Theories, in other words, have to be practically applicable. The theory that you pick or theories that you pick have to be practically applicable to the research questions that you're asking. So obviously, one of the things that you would look at is, okay, does the theory give me a way of measuring something important related to what I'm interested in, right? Is the instrument that I'm using or the approach that I'm taking, is it something that is sustainable or supportable by the theory that I've chosen? Right. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the theory that is applicable and that you're going to be able to use, that you can connect what you're looking for, what you're looking at, how you're looking at it, how you're measuring it, how you're analyzing it. All of that should be informed by the particular theory that you pick. Now, you can't do that unless you already know, unless you've been already working in an area for a while. You can't know what theory will work for you unless you do a broad survey of all the theories related to whatever it is that you're interested in. So I just did a talk at a conference, and I talked about a lot of stuff that people believe are true that are not true in education. And one of the things that people talk about all the time is the idea of learning styles. And typically they talk about learning styles in terms of the VAK model, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. That's one of over 70 different ideas about how learning styles work, what kind of learning styles there are. There are models I'm sure that you've never heard of before, right? But we don't generally tend to think of those. We tend to think of the VAK because that one is the one that's most ubiquitous. That's the one that everybody talks about. Now, here's the other problem, though, with that model. Virtually no research, there's no empirical research to support the existence of learning styles. Let me say that again. After decades of research, there's no experimental evidence for the existence of learning styles. Does that shock you? Maybe. But the point is that you wouldn't know that without going into the literature to explore whether or not it was there in the first place. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of stuff in education that's really popular that's not supported by any research. The idea of growth mindset or grit is another example, right? The idea of multiple intelligences, Gardner's multiple intelligences. There's a lot of stuff that people do using these theories in an effort to improve instruction, for example, but the starting point's not supported by any research. Why is that an important consideration? Well, unless you're starting with a brand new theory that hasn't had an opportunity to be tested, you don't want your starting point to be a theory, even if it's been around for a long time, that doesn't have any support. Because if it doesn't have any support, then there's no reason to believe that that theory is any better explanation of the phenomena that you're interested in than any other theory, or no theory at all, right? So you do a broad survey of the literature. You start to get to know. You don't focus your research or your review of the literature from the get-go on your specific research problem. You do a broader review of the literature to see what people already know and what research has already been done. You could potentially find out that the questions that you're asking have not only already been asked and answered, but asked and answered repeatedly. In other words, you're not actually researching anything new. And then the question is, well, since they've already answered this question multiple times, why are you examining it? Right? Don't forget that regardless of whether you're working on dissertation or you're a college professor or you're somebody else and you're sharing your research, you're sharing your research findings, you're going to be called on always to defend that research, right? In dissertation, we call it a defense, but outside of that, it's peer review where other people like you look at what you've done, and they will ask you to explain why you did this, or they'll criticize your choices, and you'll be called on to defend, to explain and defend the choices that you made. And ultimately, it'll be the decision of your peers whether or not what you've done is judged to be worthwhile, to be included in the dissemination of knowledge, right? That you're always going to be defending. And that's important because we have a tendency as human beings to fall prey to basically looking for things and recognizing things that agree with what we already think, right? It's confirmatory bias. And we have a tendency not to see things, literally not to see or recognize things that don't agree with what we already believe is true or what we already think is true. And research is about trying to get at, right? Trying to get at something that goes beyond our own judgment, our own perception, and that is more broad and more inclusive so that it's more informative, right? It informs others. It's useful to others, not just to ourselves. Once you identify the appropriate theory, then the theory, and you think about how that theory is applicable to your question, then that theory suggests what are important methods for you to use. Now, you've heard it said before, I'm sure, that research questions determine the methodology, or that your methods come from your research questions. And that's only partly true, because your research questions also have to be informed by your starting place, by your philosophy, right? So if you're an empiricist or a positivist, you're not going to be interested in doing qualitative research. It's not about what's easier, or it's not about what you prefer. It's going to be contrary to what your basic philosophical assumptions are about how things work, right? Or if you're a critical theorist, for example, you're not going to be doing quantitative research necessarily, because you're going to be more broadly concerned by interactions and dynamics that are not addressable using traditional quantitative methods. Your philosophy makes a difference. Your theory makes a difference, right? Both of those contribute to the decisions you make about the methods that you choose. Beyond methods, both of them also inform you about the kind of information, the nature of the information that you have to collect in order to answer the questions you're asking. So that information might be best collected in a questionnaire, or it could best be collected by interview, or it could best be collected by a psychological test, or it could best be collected by self-report, right? But that's not a decision you make based on what you want to do. That's a decision that you have to make based on the theory and the philosophy, what's already known, what still needs to be known and elaborated on, and how all of that connects to each other in terms of addressing a need, or addressing or attempting to solve a problem that has some importance. The methods and the data collection also will help to inform, but they're also informed by the methodology. They're also informed by the theory, right? But will inform how you go about analyzing the information you collect. Generally speaking, when we talk about data analysis, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, essentially what we're doing is we're reducing observations down, whether we're aggregating them or whether we're going through narrative and attempting to identify, codes, categories, and themes. Whatever we're doing, we're attempting to take this big observation, this big, broad observation, and distill it down into these meaningful chunks or pieces. So when we take a bunch of data and we get the average and the standard deviation, we're taking all this collective group information from all these individuals, and we're not now describing any individual, we're describing the group as a whole, right? We're transforming the information. Now that's a good thing because it enables us to make broad judgments and broad generalizations. It enables us to transfer what we've learned in one setting to another setting, right? But it also has a downside too. When we aggregate information, when we reduce it and bring it together, it comes at a cost. And the cost is, right, number one, we lose some precision. Give you an example. If we took everybody's, well, we won't, but if we took everybody's weight in the class and we averaged it out, that average would speak to the characteristic of all of the group, all of us in the class as a whole, but it would be very poor way of describing your weight individually. Maybe a little bit, or maybe a lot, right? So if the average weight in here was like, 140, that would be really off for me. So I weigh a lot more than 140, right? But some of you, it might be way off because it's not way under, but it's way over. Some of you probably weigh much less than that. But the idea is that, but when we aggregate or we combine data, we lose some precision. That happens in quantitative analysis as well. When you go through all of the narrative that you've captured, for example, and you identify codes, you combine those codes to come up with categories, you understand and you analyze those categories ultimately to determine themes, you're losing the precision of each individual's contribution in order to make a statement, in order to describe the group as a whole. And while you can describe the group very well, that group description isn't necessarily a very good description at the individual level. We analyze data and we try to aggregate it so that we can make some sense out of it, so it can become meaningful. Right? It's hard to describe or to explain meaning from 20 hours worth of interview recordings. Right? It's hard to make meaning out of 200 people responding to a 20 item questionnaire. What does it mean? What are they saying? What are we learning from that? Right? So this data analysis helps us to make meaning. It helps us to be able to say something from all of the information we've collected about that's relevant to the questions that we asked to begin with, that we thought would be really helpful in solving the problem that we started everything for. These results then basically set the stage for drawing conclusions. Those conclusions could be if-then conclusions, for example, cause and effect. Those conclusions might be relationship. We're not exactly sure why two things seem to be related, but we can demonstrate that they are, that when we have one variable, we're going to see some kind of a relationship in the value of another variable, right? We can use these data to maybe figure out that there are subgroups in our big group that we didn't know initially existed to begin with, right? So a lot of times we start off a priori assigning our respondents to groups and then comparing those groups, right? Freshmen versus seniors in college, and what are the likelihoods that they're going to persist to the following year. But there could be other groups within those observed or those automatically recognizable groups that we just don't know about. And our data analysis might help us to see those groups and identify things that we didn't know existed and open the door for some additional testing, for some additional research. Our conclusions, but we don't stop with the conclusions. We have to go to the next step, and that's the so what step. That so what's that means you're taking the conclusions that you make. You're taking the learning that you just finished accomplishing as a result of your study, and you're applying that learning to the questions that you asked in order to help solve the problem that started everything in the first place. In the end, research is about solving problems. Sometimes those problems are too big to address, and we have to reduce them down and look at them in little pieces that we can handle. But ultimately, the goal is to solve problems, to make things, to work things out in a way that's going to be of benefit, not just to us, but to everyone, right? Even when you see people doing research just to explore, just to try to learn something new, right? They're contributing to a knowledge base with the idea, with the assumption that ultimately that knowledge is going to be applicable to solving a problem. It's really all predicated on problem solving. The last thing I'll say about all of this is that you need to be prepared to be surprised. If you go into a research project and you expect, and as a matter of fact, you not only do you expect, but you already believe that you know what the outcome's going to be, right? And you're pretty positive that's what the outcome's going to be, then I wonder why you're asking those questions in the first place. You know, are you making a case? Are you engaging in something to try to influence policy, for example? Or why would you do that? Ultimately, if you're asking questions that you already know the answer to, you have to take a step back and ask yourself, why am I asking this question? And remember, when we say you already know the answer to it, we're not just saying you personally based on your experience. We're saying you informed by the experience of everyone who's researched the same thing that you're interested in. Now, there can be really good reasons for asking the same questions that already have been answered, but they're particular. They have to be particular. You have to know what those reasons are. So, for example, you might be interested in the application of a theory that was developed in the West in a culture and in a community that's in the Middle East or the Far East. Why would you ask that question? Because you might wonder whether or not there are cultural or economic or historical or geographical or other variables, other mediators and moderators, which could influence the demonstrated relationships in other places. And you want to make sure that those relationships hold true in this new place. So you're looking at what's already known for given populations, and you're trying to see whether or not what is already known still works with a new population. Or you may be looking at research and discover that there was somebody, basically people who had been looking at something, or we're all looking at it in a particular way, but that particular way wasn't exactly entirely correct, right? So maybe they were using an instrument, or they had an idea about a construct, right? A construct is an idea, it's a made-up explanation for something. So when we see people who persist and they keep on persisting, even though they might have some trial or some difficulty, we say, well, that's because those people are motivated. But motivation is a construct. It's something we made up to explain why some people try harder and longer than other people. We don't really know that motivation actually exists, and we can't measure it directly. We can just measure motivation indirectly on the basis of what we expect motivation would result in, right? So persistence, for example. So the more somebody keeps on trying and less likely they are to give up, we'll say that that's because of motivation. But you see, we're not actually measuring motivation. We can't open up somebody's head and look inside and see motivation. We can't put them on any kind of imaging and say, oh yeah, look how much motivation they have. It's a construct. It's something that we made up. Intelligence is another example of that. Leadership. You know, what is actually leadership? What does leadership mean? How do you define that leadership? Brings me to my last point. Maybe my last point. And that is, when you do anything, when you start moving into research and you move from concepts to constructs, when you go from propositions to hypotheses, right? you have to start thinking in terms of what's observable and measurable. And that means you have to come up with ways of observing and measuring, recognizing that those ways of observing and measuring are a decision you make, right? It may be something that you do as a result of consensus because everyone's just agreed. It's like, why is statistical significance 0.05? We just decided it was, that's why. There's no rule, there's no theory, there's no, I mean, it's just, we just all agreed that unless we get to 0.05, it's not significant. There's a lot of things like that. And your job as a researcher is to define, is to explain how you're defining, explain, right? We call it an operational definition. How are you operationalizing the construct or the concept that you're exploring? So when we talk about intelligence, right, somebody a long time ago famously said, intelligence is what intelligence tests measure, right? The construct is defined and measured in a particular way, right? And that's what we talk about. Really, when we look at the relationship between intelligence and school achievement, for example, what we're really looking at is the relationship between the results on an intelligence test and the results on an achievement test, right? We're looking at two scores from two tests, and we call one intelligence and we call one achievement, and we say, we see intelligence is related to achievement. Maybe, right? The other reason that we continue to ask questions, maybe look at new populations and think about whether or not what holds true one place, maybe whether it might or might not hold true in another place, is because of the whole idea that we start with we're starting from an assumption base, we're starting with the theory, and we recognize the possibility, right? Even if we don't like to recognize it, we recognize the possibility that the theory could be wrong. We might be doing everything on the basis of a theory that isn't a good theory, that doesn't accurately describe the phenomena or as accurately describe the phenomena maybe as another theory might. Yeah, so my students heard the example, but for decades, for 100 years, every educated person knew gravity from Newton's perspective is Newtonian gravity, right? We all, that was what gravity was. Nobody questioned it. The mathematics were great. They were very powerful predictors. So nobody questioned the theory until, right, people started thinking about it, and a fellow named Einstein came up with a completely different way of thinking about gravity, different mathematics. And what happened was Einstein's theory was a better predictor than Newton's was. Because it was a better predictor, we felt like, okay, well, then Einstein's theory must be more closely or more or better description of the phenomena of gravity than Newton's was. But it's not just in science, right? You hear people talking all the time about people who have a lot of ego or big egos or whatever, right? Well, those notions are attributable to a Viennese physician named Freud. And Freudian psychology was very, very powerful. I mean, that was the way we understood the psychodynamics was the way we understood psychopathology for a long time, right? And then new models came along that did a better job of predicting and also were more practical in terms of figuring out how to help people with conditions. And so gradually Freud's theory was revised and revised, but there's still elements from the theory that we retain today because they're good explanations for why or how people operate. And ego is one of those ideas. I think I've talked already too much. I'm going to stop. I don't like talking so much. It's your turn. Somebody ask me a question, say something smart.